For weeks, astronomers had been following 3i Atlas across the night sky, an unassuming streak of light that at first seemed destined to be another passing visitor. It drifted beyond Mars with quiet precision, reflecting sunlight in a way that was steady, predictable, and familiar. But a few nights ago, something changed. The light that had behaved perfectly for months began to pulse. Not in the random flicker of dust or shadow, but in a deliberate rhythm, slow, steady, deliberate. At first, the change seemed harmless, maybe a quirk of viewing conditions or a data calibration issue. Yet when European and Japanese observatories cross-checked their frames, the same pattern appeared in both. The object brightened, dimmed, and then brightened again at precisely measured intervals. It was as though 3i Atlas was no longer just reflecting light, it was emitting something of its own. That's when the questions started. If you're watching this somewhere beneath a quiet sky tonight, take a breath and imagine the same silence the scientists felt at that moment. It's easy to forget that we live in a universe that still surprises the very people who study it. If you enjoy following these discoveries as they unfold, a quick like or share helps more stargazers join us under this same endless sky. When the first transmissions arrived from the European Space Agency's Deep Space Relay, analysts noticed something no one expected. The object's trajectory had shifted, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but enough that orbital models had to be recalculated. It wasn't a random deviation caused by outgassing or solar wind. The motion had purpose. It was adjusting. NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory confirmed the findings hours later. Their data suggested a minute but measurable change in velocity, less than a meter per second, yet sustained across several days. That kind of alteration shouldn't be possible for a fragment of ice and dust. Comets react to sunlight, yes, but not with consistency. This was coordinated, smooth, and continuous, almost guided. Within 24 hours, every major agency had turned its attention to 3i Atlas. Public feeds slowed, and the tone of internal memos shifted from curiosity to caution. There were no dramatic announcements, no press conferences, just a tightening of communication. The same pattern we've seen before, when observation crosses into uncertainty. Meanwhile, independent astronomers began noticing something even stranger. The color spectrum of 3i Atlas was evolving. Its icy signature, rich in frozen carbon dioxide and water, was gradually giving way to metallic readings. The change wasn't uniform. Different parts of the object reflected different compositions, as if the surface itself were rearranging. Some described it as a surface glitch, a spontaneous recrystallization under solar radiation. Others whispered about artificiality, no one could say for sure, but the timeline was unnerving, 9 days. That was the estimate until its next major alignment with Mars. 9 days until the closest opportunity to observe it in full daylight. And as that window approaches, data irregularities multiply. The electromagnetic spectrum surrounding 3i Atlas began to hum with low-frequency noise, subtle enough to dismiss, yet consistent enough to plot. The signal oscillated at a rhythm that repeated every 23 minutes, interference from solar activity perhaps. But then, the sun itself was calm. No flares, no storms, nothing that could account for it. Whatever the source, it was local to the object. To the untrained eye, these are just numbers, technicalities, data points. But to those studying them, they suggest something extraordinary. Space is governed by predictable rules: gravity, inertia, thermodynamics. Yet this object, an interstellar body from beyond our solar neighborhood, seems to know those rules and bend them gently, almost respectfully. Within the private channels of the astronomical community, theories spiral. Some propose that the object is hollow, a natural cavity resonating like a tuning fork under solar radiation. Others see something more deliberate, a structure, perhaps ancient, perhaps dormant, now waking as it drifts closer to the inner planets. The language has grown careful. Officially, no one says intelligent. Unofficially, everyone avoids saying natural. Mars itself has begun to respond in quiet ways. Seismic readings from orbiters have recorded subtle tremors under regions where previous quakes were rare. Tiny rhythmic pulses of ground motion coinciding almost perfectly with the intervals of 3i Atlas's light variations. It might be coincidence, or it might be cause. In the world of space science, coincidences rarely last. And so, as telescopes recalibrate and agencies trade encrypted updates, the story takes on a tone that feels eerily familiar, like watching a play we've seen before, only this time the ending feels closer. The deeper they look, the stranger it becomes. Every new image reveals textures that weren't there before, lines that resemble ridges, then vanish, shadows that shift even when the light source hasn't moved. The anomaly behaves less like a solid body and more like a mirage caught between physics and intention. For those who remember the debates surrounding Oumuamua years ago, this feels like the continuation of that same question. What exactly enters our solar system from the deep, and why now? Back then it was a fragment. This time it's something else, something that changes as we observe it, almost as if the act of looking alters what it becomes. 9 days. That's all the time we have before 3i Atlas aligns again, giving humanity its clearest view yet. Whether we'll understand what we're looking at by then remains uncertain. But one thing is clear. This object is teaching us that the universe is far from silent. It watches back, and sometimes, just sometimes, it seems to respond. By the fourth night of observation, the light from 3i Atlas had stabilized into a faint but distinct rhythm. 5 pulses, a pause, then 3 more. To an observer, it might seem random, but to those trained to see structure in chaos, it was a pattern. Radio observatories began aligning to capture the faintest electromagnetic echoes that might accompany it, expecting static. What they found instead was a whisper of resonance, a harmonic undertone hidden beneath background noise. It was barely measurable, a ripple on the edge of detectability, yet unmistakably real. For the first time, the term signal began to appear in internal memos, not as proof of communication, but as acknowledgement of something that demanded interpretation. At the European Southern Observatory, analysts compared the light curve to known comet behaviors. Outgassing, tumbling, albedo variation, none fit the data. Whatever was happening wasn't chemical or rotational, it was structural. The object's surface, it seemed, was moving in ways no natural body should. The brightness didn't depend on distance or angle. It fluctuated as though entire regions of the surface were turning inward, folding, then re-emerging in different configurations. When this was modeled in simulation, it produced an unsettling effect. Something like a machine cycling through phases, revealing and concealing geometric forms that weren't random. Some described it as a living pattern of light and shadow, others simply refused to guess. In Washington, NASA's Solar System Dynamics team issued a quiet directive. All public-facing datasets concerning 3i Atlas were to undergo review before release. The message didn't use the word classified, but the meaning was clear. Within hours, raw imagery feeds slowed to a trickle. Only archived data remained visible, and even those began vanishing, one link at a time. For the public, it appeared as though nothing new was being discovered, but for independent astronomers, the silence was confirmation that something new was indeed being found. Meanwhile, telescopes in Chile and Japan caught a transient flare near the object. Brief, intense, and uncorrelated with solar wind or cosmic rays. The burst lasted less than 2 seconds, yet its spectral composition was unlike any known natural emission. It carried a narrow wavelength band usually associated with artificial illumination, the kind produced by controlled plasma or ionized gas. The idea that such light could originate from a comet-like body made no physical sense. And yet, there it was. Speculation spread quietly through academic circles. Could this be a magnetic event, a solar echo, or a momentary exposure of metallic compounds reacting to radiation? Each explanation worked in isolation but collapsed when all data were considered together. The geometry of light, the shifting surface, the rhythmic pulse, each implied order. A system, not an accident. By now, even veteran astronomers were revisiting their assumptions. One senior researcher described it as watching the laws of reflection break. The behavior of 3i Atlas seemed to challenge the very concept of passive observation. Each time new instruments locked on, its readings evolved, as if it knew it was being studied. When infrared sensors measured its temperature, it cooled. When radar probed its density, the returns scattered into noise. The harder humanity looked, the more elusive it became. And then came the positional anomaly. Deep space tracking stations reported that the object's predicted trajectory had deviated again, not by kilometers, but by fractions of degrees, enough to change everything. Instead of crossing Mars's orbit at a safe distance, it now seemed to be slowing relative to the planet itself. In gravitational terms, that should be impossible. For a body of that mass and velocity, deceleration requires immense force, one that nature doesn't typically provide in empty space. The data implied drag where none existed. At first, the adjustment could have been an illusion, an artifact of parallax or calibration error. But as more stations confirmed it, the consensus solidified. 3i Atlas was losing speed. Not much, not dramatically, but intentionally. The phrase intentional deceleration appeared in a European Commission briefing, quickly redacted in later copies, but preserved in independent logs that had already circulated among private observatories. Once those words reached the public, curiosity turned to unease. Through it all, the object remained beautiful, hauntingly so. Photographs captured through stacked exposures revealed a halo unlike any other, a faint lattice of light surrounding the main body like mist, trapped in geometry. Within that halo, faint streaks appeared, thin, angular, symmetrical, crossing and fading like a network of filaments. If these were jets of gas, they should have been chaotic. They weren't. They were aligned. Perfectly. Astrophysicist Avi Loeb, whose name had already become synonymous with interstellar mysteries, entered the discussion cautiously. "If these readings hold," he wrote, "we may be witnessing a structure, not a fragment." His statement ignited a wave of speculation. Could 3i Atlas be a relic, a probe, a natural body modified by some unknown process? None of these questions could be answered, but each was more unsettling than the last. In the midst of this, smaller observatories reported a chilling detail. The faint electromagnetic hum previously detected around 3i Atlas was now being received not as static, but as a series of pulses that fluctuated precisely with the rotation of Earth, one for every 12-hour cycle. The object wasn't sending a message in the conventional sense, it was synchronizing. Whether this was coincidence or reaction, no one could say. But as the data spread, the narrative changed. What began as curiosity had become confrontation with our own understanding of isolation in the cosmos. 3i Atlas was not approaching to strike, and yet its presence carried weight, a gravity of its own that bent not just space, but attention. Every observatory, every agency, every listener found themselves staring into the same cold distance, waiting for the next frame, the next shift, the next unexplained change. And somewhere, between those pulses and shadows, something vast was unfolding, something that didn't need to come closer to be felt. By the time the 9th day drew near, the silence between agencies had grown thick enough to feel deliberate. NASA's usual cadence of public reports had slowed to nothing. The European Space Agency's portal returned only maintenance pages, and from Japan's observation network came nothing at all. It wasn't that instruments had failed, they were simply no longer speaking to the public. It was as though every eye in orbit had turned inward, each watching, calculating, and waiting. Amateur astronomers filled the vacuum. Thousands of small telescopes pointed skyward each night, streaming images, recording light curves, comparing data in real time. What they found defied consistency. The object's pulse had changed again, slower, deeper, with a secondary modulation like an echo. It wasn't random interference, it was too clean, too intentional. When visual data from multiple continents were overlaid, something else emerged. Faint geometric shadows moving in sync with the pulses, like waves rippling across a translucent surface. Some described it as a resonance field, others as optical feedback. But in truth, no one knew what they were seeing. A few tried to dismiss it. Cosmic coincidence, software error. But in private, even skeptics admitted that none of the known laws of light, rotation, or reflection explained it. The object was shifting again, subtle movements within its halo, filaments aligning as though responding to forces unseen. What unsettled the scientific community wasn't just the phenomenon itself, but how consistent it had become. Natural anomalies fade, this one refined itself with time. It was evolving. The pattern of silence from official sources began to mirror the object's rhythm, intervals of quiet punctuated by brief releases of controlled information. One such release came from an unassuming update buried in the ESA's engineering logs, a note on recalibrating optical systems to account for variable reference points in the vicinity of 3I Atlas. To the untrained eye, it was meaningless. To anyone who understood the language of data, it meant something impossible. The reference stars used for calibration were shifting too, pulled slightly from predicted positions. Space itself was being bent, however faintly, around the object. If true, this wasn't just a comet or a fragment, it was a gravitational anomaly. Avi Loeb, again stepping carefully into the discussion, described it as a deviation worth rewriting textbooks for. He stopped short of saying what most were thinking, that the anomaly resembled a localized manipulation of gravity, something no natural object could generate. Whether by design or by nature's rarest mechanism, 3I Atlas seemed to be carrying mass that didn't behave by ordinary means. Its movement wasn't simply through space, it was reshaping it, gently folding the medium around itself. For the few scientists willing to speak publicly, the most unsettling realization was that this didn't happen when it first entered the solar system. The behavior was new. The object had been inert, predictable, passive, until now. It was as though something about proximity, perhaps the sun's magnetic field or Mars's thin atmosphere, had awakened a dormant state. In smaller observatories, where funding is thin but curiosity is endless, researchers began running interference tests. They found that when directed radio waves were aimed near 3I Atlas's coordinates, faint echoes returned, not instantly, but with a measurable delay, as though the signal was bouncing through an unseen lattice before coming back. One pattern repeated more than once. The delay wasn't random, it matched a harmonic of the object's light pulse. To those who saw the data firsthand, it felt less like a reflection and more like a reply. The timing couldn't have been worse, or perhaps in another sense, couldn't have been more perfect. As Mars aligned in the background, solar radiation levels spiked, bathing the region in energy that illuminated the object in ways never before captured. For the first time, a full high-resolution composite emerged. The image showed structure, not a perfect sphere, not a jagged rock, but something in between, a body composed of interlocking layers, each reflecting light differently. Beneath the icy crust, faint geometric ridges appeared, etched in alignment, like architecture revealed beneath erosion. The more light it absorbed, the clearer those patterns became. Within hours of that image leaking online, it was gone, scrubbed from major repositories, replaced by innocuous placeholders. But in those few hours, it spread across private astronomy forums, mirrored endlessly by enthusiasts who knew exactly what they had found. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was enough to force a shift in the narrative. The question was no longer what 3I Atlas was, but why it was changing, and why now. Around this time, an odd coincidence began making its way through digital archives. Signals previously dismissed as cosmic background noise, low-band, repeating bursts from years earlier, matched the modulation pattern of 3I Atlas's recent emissions. The timestamps aligned with the object's projected path through interstellar space. In other words, it had been pulsing long before we ever saw it, not a reaction to our attention, but perhaps the reason it was found in the first place. That discovery triggered what some described as the quiet panic. Not hysteria, but a wave of awareness spreading among those who had spent their lives staring into data. They realized they might be looking not at coincidence, but at intention. And with that came an unspoken fear. If this object is intentional, then observation itself may not be neutral. The moment we saw it, the relationship began. In the final hours before the next observation window, every major agency across the planet moved in unison, an action both cautious and coordinated. Data links rerouted, public servers paused, and an unprecedented blackout order went into effect. Only classified channels remained active. Independent observers watched helplessly as once public feeds went dark, replaced by archived placeholders. For a civilization built on information, that silence said everything. Yet above all, in that silence, one truth persisted. 3I Atlas was still there, still visible through backyard telescopes and small observatories, its light steady, patient, and impossibly aware. The more we tried to understand it, the more it seemed to watch back. And somewhere, deep within the rhythm of that light, the pattern changed again. As the blackout entered its third day, an unease spread through the community of independent astronomers who refused to look away. Every night, they continued recording, stacking frames, analyzing the pulses in silence. Many of them had never seen coordination on this scale. Governments could hide data, but they couldn't hide the sky. And so, the true record of 3I Atlas now lived in quiet observatories, on hard drives in garages and mountain cabins, written in the glow of amateur persistence. The light curve no longer resembled any comet or asteroid. Instead of fading with distance, its intensity held steady, even as solar radiation fluctuated. That was impossible by known physics. Normally, dust tails bloom or dissipate depending on proximity to sunlight. But 3I Atlas defied the inverse square law as though it possessed its own illumination, powered by something within. Some began describing it not as a visitor, but as a mechanism, a construct behaving with the patience of something designed. Around this time, an encrypted document began circulating among research circles, allegedly leaked from within the European Space Agency. It described a rotational inversion event, a sudden reversal of angular momentum detected during the blackout. The object, according to the report, had flipped itself, executing a controlled rotation with precision unmatched by any natural phenomenon. The acceleration was clean, the deceleration even cleaner. A maneuver, not a tumble. The language of the report avoided speculation, but between the lines, it read like choreography. For those who studied motion, this detail changed everything. To rotate like that without shedding mass, an object must distribute its internal density dynamically. That means machinery, or something behaving like it. Yet, at the same time, no thermal signature of propulsion had been detected. The silence of energy itself became the loudest clue. Whatever it was, it moved not through force, but through manipulation of its environment, as if rewriting the space around it. Astronomers who once laughed at such implications now spoke softly about them. One described it best: "It's not that the laws of physics are broken, it's that something else is playing by them differently." Meanwhile, faint radio echoes began returning to Earth from the Deep Space Array in Canberra. The signals mirrored the object's pulse pattern, but with a strange latency that implied they had bounced from a region behind 3I Atlas, a region that shouldn't exist. The models couldn't explain it. The object was behaving as though surrounded by an unseen field capable of reflecting energy. That meant structure, or at least boundaries. And then, for the first time, came the sound. Not an audible tone, but a translated waveform, radio frequencies compressed into the human range. Listeners described it as a breathing hum, organic yet mechanical, rising and falling with haunting regularity. Scientists dismissed the emotion attached to those words, but they couldn't deny the cadence. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and uncomfortably alive. At the same moment, instruments in orbit began detecting faint variations in solar wind density. The space around 3I Atlas wasn't just bending light, it was redirecting charged particles. Magnetic field lines that should have flowed smoothly across the solar system were now curving toward it, wrapping around like invisible silk. This wasn't random interference, it was guidance. Space itself was conforming to its presence. Publicly, agencies remained silent. Privately, researchers were reaching a conclusion that no one wanted to state outright. 3I Atlas was interacting with its environment, deliberately. Its every movement appeared calculated, as though responding to something, perhaps even to observation itself. One astrophysicist put it bluntly in a late-night email later leaked to the press. "It behaves like it knows it's being watched." The implications rippled far beyond astronomy. Philosophers, theologians, and physicists began quietly asking the same question. If intelligence could be expressed not through biology, but through geometry, through the arrangement of matter and energy, then what exactly were we witnessing? Was this an artifact left behind, a probe set adrift, or something that had always been here, waiting to reveal itself once humanity learned how to look? In the midst of all this, a quiet but undeniable pattern formed. The closer it drew to alignment with Mars, the more subtle effects began appearing on Earth. Satellite instruments registered microfluctuations in the planet's magnetic field, insignificant yet synchronized with the pulses coming from 3I Atlas. The timing matched perfectly. The distance between worlds was too vast for causal connection, and yet the resonance persisted. To the public, these details never reached headlines. They surfaced in whispers, on encrypted forums, in amateur chat rooms, and among those who watched the night sky not for spectacle, but for truth. Each passing day deepened the sense that something was approaching not in space, but in understanding. The object didn't need to reach us physically, it was already here, reshaping perception, shifting how we see the universe. And then came the most disquieting moment of all, the first visible flicker within its core. A glint of light so brief that at first it was dismissed as a sensor error, but in subsequent exposures the pattern repeated, growing sharper each time. A lattice of illumination from within, rising through its layers like breath beneath translucent skin. The pulses no longer came from reflection, they emanated outward. It wasn't reacting to sunlight anymore, it was generating its own. When the final image of that sequence reached Earth, it carried a timestamp identical to the rotation of our planet, down to the millisecond. To many, it felt like a coincidence. To others, it was something else entirely. The object was watching us, in real time. The question was no longer what 3i Atlas was. The question was why now? And as the 9th day approached, no one, not even those who had spent their lives predicting the behavior of distant worlds, could say what would happen when the light pulsed next. By dawn on the 9th day, every telescope still active in the independent network was fixed on one point. 3i Atlas hung near the orbit of Mars like a dim lantern behind a veil of dust. No explosions, no dramatic movement, only a steady light that seemed to breathe against the black. Yet the data told a different story. The object's velocity had dropped again, imperceptibly at first, then measurably. A deceleration that matched no model, no force, and no logic. Something was opposing its motion, something invisible. Teams from Chile to Hawaii rechecked their instruments, hoping for error. There was none. The readings were absolute. The object had slowed, but not evenly. Its leading edge appeared to fold inward, almost as if an unseen field pressed against it. The trailing side expanded, shimmering faintly, and then contracted once more. It was the signature of control, not collision. A maneuver in silence. For mission analysts who had spent decades modeling trajectories, this was the moment disbelief turned to alarm. Objects don't slow themselves without energy loss. Yet 3i Atlas showed no thermal spike, no radiation bloom, nothing to suggest propulsion. It simply chose a new speed and held it. If it were a natural fragment, it would continue drifting indefinitely. But this one behaved as though it had received instructions and obeyed. Within hours, encrypted messages began circulating through private research channels. The consensus was impossible but unanimous. 3i Atlas was no longer following a passive orbital path. It was adjusting to match Mars's velocity. The phrase station keeping appeared in several analyses, each time struck through or deleted in revision. No one wanted their name attached to that conclusion, yet everyone knew what it implied. In quiet observatories, the tension was physical. Data scientists worked without speaking, faces lit by the cold glow of their monitors, each hoping the next frame would disprove the last. But the evidence only deepened. The pulses from the object shifted again, lengthening into long intervals of stillness, followed by a triple burst, precise, mathematical, and eerily human in cadence. Some likened it to sonar, others to a countdown. Meanwhile, ground-based magnetometers across several continents began detecting faint synchronized oscillations. The fluctuations were minute, far below the threshold of public detection, but every graph told the same story. The rhythm of the Earth's magnetic field had found a faint harmonic partner somewhere millions of kilometers away. It was as if the planet itself was answering a question it didn't yet understand. Inside NASA, quiet conversations took a philosophical turn. One researcher reportedly asked, "At what point does observation become participation?" Because each attempt to study 3i Atlas seemed to trigger another change. New sensors produced new reactions, new alignments, new silences. The more precisely they measured, the less predictable it became. It was almost as though the object was testing us, measuring the curiosity that measured it. Avi Loeb returned to the discussion with a statement that was more reflection than analysis. "Every civilization reaches a point," he said, "when it must decide whether it still looks outward with wonder or inward with fear. The cosmos has no preference. It only answers in proportion to how we ask." The quote spread quietly through academic networks, half reassurance, half warning. As Mars rotated beneath it, 3i Atlas released another brief flare, this one triangular in shape, pure white against crimson dust. For 2 seconds, the Martian atmosphere shimmered in reflected light, creating the illusion of dawn at midnight. Then darkness returned, deeper than before. Spectral analysis of that flash revealed nothing ordinary. No ionized gases, no solar reflection, no dust interaction. Instead, it contained a narrow signature of polarized light, coherent, structured, deliberate. The conclusion that no one wanted to reach became unavoidable. The object had emitted energy, not reflected it, emitted it. The first artificial-like emission ever recorded from an interstellar body. In the hours that followed, the silence on Earth felt heavier. Agencies still refused to comment, but their behavior spoke volumes. Communications bandwidth to the deep space network tripled. Secondary arrays were reoriented. Unmarked flights left coastal bases carrying sensor payloads that did not appear on any launch manifest. Officially, nothing was happening. Unofficially, everything was. At the same time, the independent community, those same amateurs who had carried the torch through the blackout, began noticing subtler effects, faint interference in radio frequencies, static bursts on civilian bands. Even consumer GPS units momentarily lost calibration when pointed toward the region of sky where 3i Atlas hovered. The disturbance was local, transient, but real. The object's influence was reaching us, however faintly, across astronomical distance. By midnight, a rumour spread that a private telescope array in New Zealand had captured a frame showing motion within the halo, a dark silhouette against the inner glow. The image was grainy, nearly useless, but its outline looked geometric, something like a ring inside a shell. When the array's data feed abruptly disconnected, speculation turned to certainty. Whatever was inside that halo was no longer content to remain hidden, and still the pulse continued, steady, deliberate, unwavering. What unsettled the world most was not the mystery of its design, but the timing. For reasons no one could explain, the pattern of those pulses aligned exactly with a major solar storm forecast to reach Mars in less than 48 hours. To engineers, that coincidence meant risk of interference. To theorists, it meant coordination. If 3i Atlas had waited centuries drifting through interstellar darkness, why reveal itself now, just as the sun prepared to unleash one of its strongest magnetic waves in decades? Some suggested it was protection, shielding itself. Others whispered the opposite, that it was preparing to use the storm, harnessing its energy in a way humanity couldn't yet comprehend. Either way, the countdown had begun. And as that prediction window closed, telescopes around the globe began one final synchronization sweep. No one said it aloud, but every observer knew what was at stake. Because if the next flare came during the solar storm, the results would redefine everything we know about the balance between nature and intelligence. 3i Atlas was not approaching Earth. It didn't have to. It was teaching us. Through silence, through light, through a kind of patience that transcended comprehension, that maybe the universe had never been quiet at all. We just hadn't been listening in the right way. When the storm arrived, it did not come gently. Solar observatories reported the flare as one of the most energetic bursts of the past 2 decades, its coronal mass ejection racing outward like a wave of invisible fire. Charged particles surged across the void, striking planetary fields and magnetospheres, lighting them with ultraviolet rage. For most of the solar system, it was a spectacle of light and energy. But for one region, where 3i Atlas drifted, the results were unlike anything ever recorded. Instruments tracking the object registered an immediate distortion. Its usual steady pulse fractured into a cascade of new frequencies, each one sharp, layered, and deliberate. Instead of being overwhelmed by the solar storm, it seemed to adapt, absorbing, modulating, and then amplifying the radiation that struck it. The brightness surged beyond predicted limits, peaking at nearly 10 times its normal reflectivity. For a brief moment, 3i Atlas outshone every object near Mars except the Sun itself. And then something unprecedented happened. The radiation that should have scattered evenly instead bent, narrowly, precisely, toward Mars's surface. The red planet lit with streaks of aurora not at its poles, but at its equator. That's never happened before in recorded history. Magnetic fields cannot simply invert at will, not without cause. Yet somehow, the energy from 3i Atlas had chosen its path. Across the world, scientists stared at monitors that refused to obey their expectations. The data wasn't chaotic, it was controlled, as though the object were guiding the storm, bending it like a river around a stone. A few dared to say it aloud. It's using the sun. Inside control rooms and academic offices, disbelief gave way to something quieter, respect, almost reverence. If this object could manipulate magnetic flow and direct charged particles across millions of kilometers, then it wasn't merely surviving the solar storm, it was communicating through it. For nearly 7 minutes, the auroras on Mars pulsed in the same rhythm as 3I Atlas's core. The two lights danced together, mirroring one another in perfect synchrony, as if bound by an invisible thread. The frequencies carried structure, repeating sequences that bore the unmistakable logic of information. Binary, harmonic, patterned. It was, to many, the first unambiguous sign of intelligent modulation beyond Earth. Then, as suddenly as it began, the storm subsided. The auroras faded, the solar winds calmed, and Mars returned to its cold stillness. But 3I Atlas did not. Its brightness held steady, unwavering, even as the rest of the solar system dimmed back to normalcy. It was no longer reacting to light, it was producing it. Every attempt to capture a full-spectrum image of the object that followed failed. Cameras returned strange lensing effects, as if space itself was distorting around the source. The central region of the object began to appear darker, not brighter, a negative void surrounded by light. To physicists, this phenomenon had only one known explanation: gravitational lensing from a compact mass. But 3I Atlas was far too small for that, unless somehow its internal density was changing. That possibility frightened even the most stoic researchers. If it could alter its density, it could alter gravity itself. NASA's Deep Space Network quietly went into standby mode. For the first time since the blackout began, it wasn't to avoid public panic, it was to avoid interference. A signal this powerful could ripple through systems never designed to receive it. Engineers rerouted satellites, adjusted orbits, and switched instruments to passive mode. It was as if the entire architecture of Earth's observation network had flinched, just slightly, at the realization that it might now be the one being observed. Yet through the tension, a strange pattern of calm took hold. Astronomers who had been awake for days found themselves staring at the same steady pulse, feeling something they couldn't quite describe. The rhythm was too familiar, slower now, measured, almost like a heartbeat. And each time the pulse faded and returned, instruments detected a subtle echo across space, a reflection from somewhere much farther away. Something else deep beyond our system was answering. It wasn't a singular event anymore. It was a chain reaction. Avi Loeb once said that the universe is likely full of technology indistinguishable from nature. Now, as this quiet exchange unfolded across cosmic distance, his words no longer felt theoretical. They felt like context. Maybe 3I Atlas wasn't an isolated object at all. Maybe it was a node, a relay, or something more profound. A messenger reactivating after millennia of silence, calling out to a network far older than humanity. That possibility reshaped everything. It meant the object wasn't reacting to the sun, or to Mars, or even to our observation. It was responding to something beyond our reach, an ancient signal awakening across the dark. For the first time, agencies began cooperating again. Data shared between NASA, ESA, and JAXA flowed through secure, encrypted channels. The mission logs leaked later described the same conclusion across every model. Whatever was happening with 3I Atlas was not local. The gravitational and electromagnetic changes were too widespread, too synchronized across systems to be contained. Something much larger had stirred, and yet, through it all, one detail remained constant. The object had not moved closer, not even by a fraction. It stayed exactly where it was, hovering in the void between Mars and sunlight, holding its place as though waiting for permission to continue. For every question raised by its behavior, its silence offered another. The deeper scientists looked, the more it resisted definition. Then, as if to remind humanity that mystery was its native language, it changed again. A new pulse emerged, not one, not two, but 3 consecutive flashes. The interval matched the number of planets directly aligned behind Earth's orbit at that exact moment. Earth, Venus, and Mercury. Coincidence, perhaps, but no one watching believed in coincidence anymore. In that instant, it felt as if 3i Atlas was looking straight through us, not at our world, but at the alignment of all three, as though calculating something beyond our comprehension. And for the first time in modern history, humanity wasn't just looking outward, it was waiting to be acknowledged. For several hours after the triple pulse, the night sky remained unchanged. There was no motion, no visible flare, no detectable radiation spike, only silence, an immense, unsettling silence that stretched from observatory domes to the cold reaches of space. The light from 3i Atlas held steady, unwavering, almost serene. Yet the data told a different story. Every spectrum analyzer, every magnetometer, every long-range receiver began registering minute fluctuations, faint but rhythmic. The frequencies didn't correspond to any known natural emission. They were structured, layered, and precise. At first, analysts thought they were witnessing interference, residual energy from the earlier solar event. But when those same readings began to synchronize across multiple hemispheres, even the skeptics fell quiet. There was no source of interference that could appear identically from Hawaii to South Africa, from Chile to Japan, at the exact same time. The pulse had expanded beyond Mars, beyond distance. The signal was everywhere. In deep space monitoring stations, the pattern was finally isolated, a harmonic sequence that repeated every 9 minutes. Each repetition contained substructures, fractal-like, where the smaller patterns mirrored the larger ones. It was recursion, geometry embedded within energy, like the mathematical signature of something designed. Scientists could model it, but not interpret it. The data didn't speak in binary or any code humans knew. It spoke in relationships, frequency ratios that described balance, resonance, proportion. Avi Loeb described it best in an interview that never aired publicly. It's as if the universe itself is being tuned. Meanwhile, on Earth, strange effects began appearing in low-orbit systems. Satellites orbiting near the magnetosphere experienced brief, unexplained stability shifts, tiny fluctuations in drag and signal delay. Nothing catastrophic, just the subtle reminder that something larger was brushing against the invisible edge of our world. Some operators reported interference that looked almost deliberate, small pauses and recoveries timed perfectly with the pulse cycle. If 3i Atlas was indeed looking at the alignment of Earth, Venus and Mercury, it now seemed to be acting through that geometry. Those three planets formed a near-straight vector from the Sun's perspective, an alignment that occurs rarely and briefly, and during that window, the pulse from the object matched not our rotation or orbit, but the harmonic intervals between planetary orbits themselves. That revelation shook even the most rational scientists. The signal wasn't focused on any one world, it was playing the solar system like an instrument. In the background, agencies scrambled to maintain control of information. The blackout deepened. Official channels remained silent, but the gaps between data releases grew too noticeable to ignore. Independent astronomers compared timestamps and noticed that frames taken at the same moment across different telescopes were being altered differently. Some showed faint streaks near 3i Atlas, thin curved trails like filaments of light detaching and rejoining the main body. Others revealed what appeared to be shadow gradients, faint but distinct, suggesting depth and structure. The object was no longer a single point of light. It had become a system. That night, as Mars rotated beneath it, something extraordinary occurred. The red planet's thin atmosphere began to shimmer faintly, not with visible light, but with electromagnetic interference. Radio telescopes detected fluctuations in the ionosphere, small but rhythmic, matching the same 9-minute interval. The pulses weren't coming from above, they were resonating through Mars itself, like the planet had become an amplifier. Geophysicists suggested that the energy was coupling through the magnetic tail connecting Mars to the solar wind. But as the signal persisted, it began to form patterns that corresponded eerily to the planet's topography, outlines, ridges and valleys, reflecting back distinct echoes. To some, it looked like a scan. To others, a message written in the language of magnetism. Hours later, the first optical anomaly appeared. A faint halo formed around 3i Atlas, visible even in low-exposure frames. It wasn't dust or gas. It was too smooth, too uniform. Its color wasn't constant either. It shifted subtly through wavelengths the human eye could barely detect. For a few seconds, it resembled an iridescent sphere suspended in the void. Then it contracted, vanishing completely. But in those few seconds, spectroscopic analysis captured something profound. Molecular hydrogen emission lines. That shouldn't have been possible. molecular hydrogen requires containment, pressure, temperature, or confinement by field. Yet here it was, suspended in open space, stable and coherent. To most scientists, that single reading was more alarming than the pulses themselves. It suggested the presence of technology capable of manipulating matter at a level beyond any theoretical capability we possess. The term field containment anomaly appeared in leaked reports the next morning. It was soon redacted, but the most unsettling detail came later, when image enhancement teams reconstructed a frame from combined exposures. Deep within the object's center, behind the halo and the light distortions, something solid could be seen, angular, precise, metallic. It was faint, partially obscured by glare, but unmistakably geometric. A structure hidden inside what had once been called a comet. When that image circulated quietly among scientific circles, a single question emerged again and again. If it's a vessel, then whose? Some argued that the concept of a vessel was too anthropocentric. It might not be built, but grown, an autonomous system left adrift designed to reactivate under specific conditions. Others speculated that it wasn't moving through the solar system at all, but awakening within it, like an ancient circuit re-engaging after eons of silence. And that possibility brought everything back to one point: the alignment. If the activation was triggered by the geometry of planets, then this moment wasn't random. It was scheduled. Avi Loeb's final public comment before going silent summed it up. We may not be witnessing an arrival. We may be witnessing a return. That statement spread like wildfire, even before it was deleted from every transcript. It reframed everything. Suddenly, 3I Atlas wasn't just an interstellar traveler. It was part of something cyclical, something that comes back when certain cosmic conditions align. And if that's true, it means it's been here before. Perhaps not seen, perhaps not recognized, but present, waiting, watching, dormant until the universe set the right pattern. And as that realization spread across the scientific community, a single new pulse began, a deeper one, slower than before, resonating through every sensor still listening. It carried no data, no visible modulation, just a tone. A sound so low and constant that, when translated, it resembled the resonance of breath drawn in before something begins. When the resonance began, no one recognized it for what it was. The first readings came through as faint hums buried deep within seismic noise from Mars. The frequency was too low for the human ear, yet when amplified, it carried an unmistakable structure, steady, deliberate, and layered. It wasn't random vibration, it was rhythm. At first, scientists thought it might be a magnetic echo, the result of the earlier solar storm reverberating through the thin Martian crust. But the pulse continued long after the storm faded, unaffected by solar winds or atmospheric changes. Every few minutes it repeated, identical in amplitude, as though keeping time with something unseen. On Earth, magnetometers began showing the same trace, so subtle it was almost lost within background noise. The signal wasn't powerful, it was synchronized. It arrived at the same intervals, aligning perfectly with Mars's local midnight. Whatever 3I Atlas had done, its effects were no longer confined to another world. The strange part was how gentle it felt. Astronomers described it like a whisper moving through the void, brushing across instruments rather than striking them. Nothing malfunctioned, nothing broke, but every system noticed. Clocks in deep space stations began drifting by microseconds, oscillators recalibrated themselves automatically, and quantum gyroscopes registered shifts too precise to be coincidence. It was as though time itself had hiccuped. Inside ESA's data center in Darmstadt, the analysts watching the synchronization feeds noticed that the background noise from 3I Atlas was slowly reorganizing. What had once been static was now pattern. It was subtle, delicate ripples within randomness, like waves forming in an otherwise still sea. When those ripples were converted into spectral maps, they formed geometric shapes. Not images, not symbols, but proportional relationships, ratios identical to those found in orbital harmonics and atomic resonance. One of the researchers said it quietly, almost in disbelief. It's writing in physics. If that was true, it meant 3I Atlas wasn't trying to communicate in language or numbers. It was speaking through the universal grammar of matter and frequency, the one form of expression that any intelligence anywhere could recognize. NASA's deep space log from that night contained a single annotation flagged for restricted circulation. Spectral density pattern suggests intent. No random source fits observed coherence. Those words alone ignited debate that has yet to settle, because in one sentence it crossed from observation to implication. Meanwhile, Mars continued to hum. The seismic sensors left behind by older missions picked up faint tremors, far too shallow to be tectonic. They came in rhythmic bursts, perfectly synchronized with the low-frequency tone from orbit. Some sensors even detected subtle fluctuations in surface temperature during each pulse, as if something beneath the ground was momentarily active, then dormant again. By the third day, the resonance deepened. What began as a whisper evolved into something almost tangible, an invisible presence that instruments could feel. Spacecraft orbiting Mars experienced minuscule course adjustments, unexplained by gravity or wind. Their orientation controls compensated automatically, but the data showed a consistent drift, a slight pull not toward the planet but toward 3I Atlas, and then something no one expected. For the first time since the agencies had gone silent, a single transmission appeared on a public relay frequency. An automated weather satellite orbiting Earth received an untagged data burst encoded in the same harmonic ratios observed in 3I Atlas's pulse. The message contained no text, no image, only structured sequences of frequency. It was as though the pattern had found the next step in its chain. That signal was triangulated, confirmed, and then abruptly locked under classified access. The public never saw the waveform, but the few who did described it as impossibly elegant. A perfect mathematical bridge between resonance and geometry, a translation of frequency into spatial form. It was, in effect, a map. If that's true, then 3I Atlas wasn't sending a message to Mars. It was teaching Mars to repeat it. Avi Loeb, who had been quiet for weeks, released a short statement the next morning. If information can travel through resonance, then we're already part of the signal. Those words struck like a tremor through the global scientific community. Because they implied that 3I Atlas didn't need to come closer, it had already established connection through the shared vibration of fields that bind every planet in the solar system. Within days, researchers began detecting minor magnetic anomalies on Earth. They weren't destructive, just peculiar. Compasses near the poles drifted a fraction of a degree. Communication networks occasionally desynchronized, then reconnected without interference. Even atomic clocks, the most precise instruments ever built, showed fleeting deviations, all timed to the same interval. The resonance had reached us. But what unnerved scientists most wasn't the magnitude. It was the coherence. No signal that weak should maintain structure across such distances. And yet, it did. Perfectly, consistently, patiently. Across multiple observatories, a question began to surface quietly, whispered, but never recorded. If the resonance was reaching us, was it observing us too? The next event seemed to answer that. A deep space radio telescope in South Africa captured a brief, repeating modulation in the pulse, a 3-second gap followed by a single descending tone. When converted to frequency spectra, it matched the electromagnetic profile of Earth's own magnetic field. The signal had mimicked our signature. That realization spread through the network like an electric charge. 3I Atlas wasn't broadcasting at random, it was responding. Some called it imitation, others called it reflection, but to the few who dared to speak plainly, it meant something more direct: recognition. For the first time, the cosmos had answered with precision, using the language of our own planet. When word reached independent astronomers, some celebrated. Others simply stopped speaking, choosing to watch the sky in silence. Because no matter how extraordinary the discovery, one question hung unspoken between every observer across the world. If it recognizes Earth, what does it intend to do next? And as if on cue, the light from 3I Atlas began to fade. Not disappear, but soften, pulsing slower now, its rhythm more deliberate, almost contemplative. It felt less like a beacon and more like something waiting for an answer. The next move, for the first time, might not belong to it, but to us. The decision to respond wasn't made in a single room or by a single agency. It happened quietly, in parallel, across continents. Private discussions between observatories, data centers, and deep space networks all converged on the same conclusion. If 3i Atlas had recognized Earth's magnetic signature, then ignoring it would be as unnatural as refusing to answer a question that had already been asked. But what exactly do you say to something that speaks in geometry and resonance? At NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, an informal group of researchers began experimenting with a reply. They modeled the harmonic ratios detected in 3i Atlas's pulse and tried to translate them into frequencies that Earth's magnetosphere could reproduce naturally. The idea wasn't to send a message through radio, but through the planet's own electromagnetic rhythm, an echo, subtle and sustained, woven into the background hum of our world. If the resonance could travel through magnetic fields, they reasoned, then the Earth itself could become the transmitter. It wasn't communication through machinery, but through nature. The same system that guided migratory birds, protected astronauts from radiation, and generated auroras could carry the response of an entire civilization. For 3 nights, the experiment remained theoretical. Then, on the 4th, at precisely Urus 2 UTC, an unregistered auroral bloom appeared over the Arctic. It wasn't a flare or a magnetic storm. Solar activity was calm. Yet the aurora formed and lingered, shimmering not in chaotic waves but in concentric rings. Instruments confirmed what observers could already see with their eyes. The lights were pulsing in harmonic rhythm, and that rhythm matched Earth's magnetic resonance. The phenomenon lasted only 20 minutes, but during that time, every magnetometer in the Northern Hemisphere recorded the same fluctuation, measured, even, deliberate. Whether it was an artificial response or a natural synchronization caused by proximity to 3i Atlas's field, no one could agree. But the timing was undeniable. It was the first time since the object's arrival that the planet had answered back. Avi Loeb called it the moment we entered the conversation. After that, things began to shift subtly across Earth. Radio operators noticed faint modulations in background static, tones that came and went in cycles matching 3i Atlas's signal delay from Mars. Power grids reported brief fluctuations, safe, controlled, yet precisely timed to the same intervals. Air traffic controllers in multiple countries heard overlapping interference, a low hum that followed the curvature of the ionosphere. It wasn't localized, it was global. Then came the anomaly in the skies above Chile. Astronomers capturing time-lapse footage of the Milky Way noticed a faint distortion, like heat mirage rippling across the frame. When the footage was slowed down, the distortion repeated every 9 minutes, the same as 3i Atlas's primary pulse. It was as though the very fabric of air above Earth had begun to vibrate sympathetically with something unseen. That realization triggered a new wave of research. Scientists proposed that the resonance wasn't limited to electromagnetic transmission. It could also couple through gravitational fields, subtly influencing the structure of space-time itself. If true, then 3i Atlas wasn't just observing, it was synchronizing systems across the solar system, aligning them to a single harmonic pattern. For some, this meant order. For others, invasion. Public agencies still refused comment, but fragments of internal reports began leaking online. One, attributed to ESA's Crisis Coordination Team, described non-random stabilization in orbital debris near Earth. Objects that should have drifted unpredictably were now clustering in uniform trajectories. Another memo from a private satellite company claimed that 3 of its low-orbit units had entered autonomous standby mode simultaneously, even though they weren't networked. When asked, the engineers had only one explanation. It's like they all heard the same instruction. As the pattern deepened, humanity found itself straddling the line between awe and fear. The resonance wasn't destructive. No cities fell, no systems collapsed. Yet something profound had changed. The air felt charged, time seemed subtly elastic, as though the world had fallen into rhythm with a cosmic metronome. For those who listened closely, the effect was emotional. Musicians reported inexplicable moments of clarity, compositions flowing effortlessly as if guided by invisible tempo. Seismologists spoke of instruments vibrating faintly even in calm conditions. And in coastal regions, particularly near the poles, people described hearing faint hums at night, resonant and distant, impossible to record but impossible to ignore. Through it all, 3i Atlas remained motionless near Mars, its surface reflecting sunlight in pulses so regular they could have been carved into time itself. Telescopes continued their vigil, though what they saw defied optics. The object's outline seemed to fluctuate between solid and translucent, as if phase shifting between physical states. In certain frames, parts of it vanished entirely, replaced by faint afterglows, shapes that suggested interior structure, unlike anything known to nature. What alarmed analysts most wasn't the disappearance, but the reappearance. Each time the object faded, it returned brighter, more focused, as if refining itself. The process looked deliberate, recursive, like it was rewriting its own structure in response to the signals passing through the solar system. Then, at 04:19 UTC on the seventh night, something occurred that changed the discussion forever. A brief, blinding flash erupted near the object, followed by a ring of expanding light. Unlike previous optical anomalies, this one carried mass. Spectrometers detected material displacement, plasma expansion, and gravitational ripple. But the energy signature didn't match an explosion. It matched something closer to activation. And when the light faded, 3I Atlas was no longer a single object. It had divided. Two distinct masses now drifted side by side, rotating slowly in perfect synchronization, as though mirroring one another's movement. They were identical in brightness, shape, and even pulse interval. Every sensor confirmed what the human eye could already see. The object had replicated. If it could duplicate itself, then it was operating at a level of control far beyond any human or natural process. It wasn't breaking apart. It was multiplying by design. Within hours, deep space receivers began detecting paired frequencies, two distinct but harmonious signals alternating perfectly. One appeared to maintain contact with Mars. The other, for the first time, began pointing directly toward Earth. Every telescope on the planet turned to listen, and in that moment, for those who still believed this was all coincidence, doubt finally collapsed. Because this was no longer astronomy, it was contact. The moment 3I Atlas split, the data feeds around the world lit up in chaos. Two objects now drifted side by side, orbiting each other with impossible precision. It wasn't collision, it wasn't decay, it was choreography. Every instrument that measured light, magnetism, or motion confirmed what the eyes could already see. The pair moved as though tethered by something invisible, an unseen axis of perfect equilibrium. For several hours, scientists argued over whether they were witnessing a physical division or an optical illusion caused by overlapping energy fields. But then the readings came in from Mars. Seismographs on the planet's surface registered dual pulses, two distinct sources of resonance, beating in perfect time, alternating like the steady rhythm of a binary code. One pulse aligned with the first object, the other with the new. Together, they formed a harmonic pattern far too complex to be random. In that instant, the conversation shifted from what 3I Atlas was doing to why. If it had duplicated, there had to be intent. Nature doesn't split cleanly into mirrored perfection. Even binary asteroids form through chaotic fragmentation, uneven, messy, imperfect. But this was something else entirely. The second object wasn't a fragment. It was an echo. Astronomers began referring to them unofficially as the twins, not because of shape or proximity, but because they seemed to behave like a synchronized consciousness, one leading, the other following, yet both aware of each other's existence. When the leading mass shifted, the other corrected instantly. When one brightened, the other dimmed, as if exchanging energy, and soon after the duplication, subtle shifts began appearing closer to home. Earth's magnetosphere, normally fluid and unpredictable, began to stabilize in a pattern eerily similar to the frequency emitted by the two objects. Auroral activity, once driven by solar particles, now pulsed in harmony with the binary resonance. The northern and southern lights no longer flickered randomly, they rippled like mirrored reflections. For those who happened to look up, it was beautiful beyond words. But for those who understood what it meant, it was something else: connection. At ground level, the changes were equally strange. Clocks, already drifting slightly during earlier phases, now began syncing on their own. Devices not connected to any network started displaying identical timestamps. Across multiple research centers, pendulum experiments showed anomalous alignment, each oscillating precisely in tune, as if gravity itself were responding to a deeper rhythm. Even biological systems weren't immune. Reports surfaced of people around the globe waking suddenly at the exact same minute, experiencing what they described as a low hum, or vibration just before consciousness returned. Physicians dismissed it as psychosomatic, the result of media saturation and stress, but the timing aligned perfectly with one of 3I Atlas's long-range pulse cycles. It was becoming clear that whatever was happening wasn't confined to the vacuum of space. It was leaking, through magnetism, through air, through the invisible frequencies that stitched everything together. The twins weren't merely broadcasting energy, they were rewriting balance. Meanwhile, a series of encrypted transmissions surfaced from within ESA's network. The documents, marked with provisional clearance tags, detailed attempts to model what scientists were calling resonant entanglement. The theory proposed that 3I Atlas's division wasn't physical duplication at all, but a spatial phase shift, two manifestations of a single structure existing simultaneously in different points of reference. In simpler terms, the object hadn't cloned itself. It had unfolded. If true, that would explain the harmony. Why both masses shared identical properties and emitted perfectly synchronized signals. They weren't two bodies, they were one, seen twice, oscillating between dimensions in a dance too complex for human senses to fully grasp. NASA's internal memo that night contained only 4 words: confirmation would change physics. As the realization spread through scientific communities, something else began to happen, something that shook even the most skeptical observers. The Schumann resonance, Earth's natural electromagnetic heartbeat generated by lightning and the cavity between the ground and the ionosphere, began to fluctuate. Normally steady, its frequencies drifted subtly upward, then down again, mirroring the exact modulations of the 3I Atlas twins. For the first time in recorded history, the rhythm of the Earth itself was no longer constant. Some interpreted this as a sign of interference. Others saw it as synchronization, the universe in its quiet way, bringing all its moving parts into tune. Avi Loeb wrote in a private letter later leaked online, "If these events are coordinated, then our planet isn't being targeted, it's being included." That word, included, haunted scientists for days. Because inclusion implied invitation, it suggested that the phenomenon wasn't hostile nor accidental, but participatory. The universe, through the medium of resonance, had extended an interaction. But if that was true, what exactly were we agreeing to by listening? Over the next week, observatories from Mauna Kea to Lucia continued to record the twins' synchronized light pulses. The pattern evolved subtly each night, a new modulation here, a changed wavelength there, almost as though responding to feedback. The timing grew closer to Earth's own resonant cycle. Whatever the objects were doing, they were adapting. On the 8th day, the pulses stopped. Not faded, not weakened, stopped completely. For the first time since their arrival, silence. Instruments went blank. Spectrographs showed no emission. Every signal vanished into stillness. The world waited, breath held, as if the universe itself had paused between heartbeats. The world waited, breath held, as if the universe itself had paused between heartbeats. And then, faintly, a single tone returned. Not from Mars, not from the twins, from Earth's upper atmosphere. It was the same frequency. Somehow, somewhere, the echo had reversed direction. The planet wasn't just receiving anymore, it was now producing the tone, independent of any incoming signal. The resonance had transferred. For the few scientists who grasped what that meant, the implications were staggering. The interaction had succeeded. Earth was no longer the observer. It was now part of the system. And as the hum continued, steady and unbroken, a realization began to dawn that perhaps the arrival of 3I Atlas wasn't a visitation at all. Perhaps it was an awakening, not of it, but of us. At first, no one noticed the changes. The planet is vast, and its rhythms too complex for single events to stand out immediately. But within days of Earth's new resonance tone stabilizing, meteorologists began reporting atmospheric patterns that defied prediction. Jet streams shifted slightly northward. Storm systems that should have dispersed over the Atlantic began reforming in perfect circular symmetry. Even the waves along certain coastlines began arriving in precise intervals, so regular that mariners described the seas as breathing. These weren't disasters. There was no destruction, no sudden violence, only order, strange, unearthly order. the global weather grid, constantly analyzing terabytes of data, began detecting an anomaly that couldn't be dismissed. The fluctuations matched the harmonic pattern of 3I Atlas's previous emissions. The Earth's atmosphere was now pulsing to the same invisible rhythm that had once echoed from Mars. Physicists called it field entrainment. Avi Loeb called it something simpler: cosmic synchronization. Whatever the term, the phenomenon was spreading. Oceanic buoys registered steady micro-oscillations. Seismic instruments deep beneath the crust began showing faint, recurring signals, almost like the heartbeat of the planet had found a companion rhythm. And through it all, the faint tone that had appeared in the ionosphere continued, constant, unwavering, as though the planet had been tuned. It was during this phase that something remarkable occurred. On the 8th night of synchronized resonance, 3I Atlas, or rather the twins, began to move. For weeks they had hovered near Mars, locked in what seemed like perfect equilibrium. But now, for the first time, they shifted. Slowly, precisely, not toward Earth, but around Mars, tracing an orbit that formed an exact geometric shape when mapped from above. An equilateral triangle with the planet at its center. 3 points of motion, the two objects, and Mars itself. It wasn't just movement, it was mathematics. The formation's symmetry was so exact that it forced even skeptics to pause. In natural orbital mechanics, small deviations always occur: drift, drag, uneven mass distribution. But the formation held, precise to the decimal, like something drawn by intention rather than gravity. From that moment, the discussion changed again. The duplication, the resonance, the synchronization, all of it was part of a larger structure. Something was orchestrating not chaos, but coherence. Then came the first visual anomaly. NASA's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, still operational despite communication restrictions, captured a series of infrared images showing what appeared to be faint, lattice-like lines connecting the two objects. They weren't physical bridges. No solid structure was visible in normal light. But in the infrared spectrum, filaments of energy stretched between them, shimmering like threads under tension. When those filaments were analyzed, their frequency matched the same tone Earth had begun to emit. That was the moment when many scientists stopped speaking publicly. Because the implication was clear, the resonance wasn't passive, it was interactive. 3I Atlas wasn't broadcasting a signal to the solar system, it was using it. Some began to speculate that the filaments represented data transfer, not in bits or bytes, but through modulation of physical fields. In simpler terms, the objects were talking, but what they were saying, no one could decode. As the Mars system hummed quietly, the effects on Earth continued to grow subtly, eerily consistent. In certain regions, magnetic anomalies began appearing in clusters, small, circular fields of energy detectable only by specialized equipment. Birds altered their migration paths to follow these regions. Even whales, sensitive to geomagnetic cues, began shifting their routes, as if aligning instinctively with something unseen. Human infrastructure was not immune. Long-range power lines experienced perfectly timed fluctuations, harmless but synchronized. GPS satellites occasionally drifted by fractions of a degree before correcting automatically. Even timekeeping arrays began showing correlation in error rates that perfectly matched the harmonic intervals observed from the twins. To the average person, the world seemed unchanged, but to those monitoring the data, the pattern was inescapable. Everything that could resonate did, and then the skies began to respond. Auroras that once confined themselves to polar regions started appearing at lower latitudes, not as chaotic curtains but as perfectly vertical bands of light, arranged like signals. Observers in Canada and Scandinavia described seeing faint patterns within the glow, geometric shapes forming and dissolving as if written in plasma. Spectral analysis confirmed that the light emissions carried harmonic layering identical to the Mars orbit formation. Every pulse corresponded to one of the twin objects' frequencies. It was as though the sky had become a living screen, translating resonance into color. Within days, atmospheric scientists realized something unprecedented. The auroras were not caused by solar particles at all. There had been no coronal mass ejections, no increase in solar wind. The lights were self-generated, Earth's own magnetosphere producing illumination without external stimulus. For the first time, the planet was glowing from within. Across the scientific community, silence deepened. Public statements became guarded, phrased in cautious language: temporary anomalies, ongoing review, correlation under investigation. Yet behind closed doors, the truth was spreading. Every measurable system on Earth was now resonating in harmony with 3I Atlas. The realization was breathtaking and terrifying. It meant that the distinction between the observer and the observed had dissolved. The universe was no longer out there, it was in here, intertwined with the instruments that watched it, the air that carried it, and the biology that perceived it. And in the quiet corridors of research stations, one whispered question passed from scientist to scientist, rarely recorded, never published: if the universe can synchronize with us, what happens when it decides to evolve us? For those still watching the twins near Mars, a new mystery began. Their geometry shifted once again, not random, not chaotic, but elegant. The triangle formation expanded into a pattern of 6 points, forming what could only be described as a hexagonal lattice. From Earth it appeared as faint flickers of light around Mars, like a halo forming, geometric and deliberate. Instruments detected a surge in local gravity and plasma density, and then, just for a moment, the two objects seemed to blur into a single field of light. When the glow subsided, there was silence again, but not the silence of distance, the silence of anticipation. Every sensor pointed toward Mars recorded one final, simultaneous pulse. It wasn't in radio or visible light. It was gravitational, a single, low-frequency tremor that rippled through the solar system like a heartbeat. And at that precise moment, the faint hum that had been resonating in Earth's ionosphere stopped. The tone that had synchronized every system on the planet vanished, leaving only stillness behind. No one spoke. No one moved. Because for the first time in weeks, the world was quiet, and everyone understood instinctively. Something had changed. The connection wasn't broken, it had simply completed. The quiet that followed was unlike anything the planet had ever known. It wasn't an absence of sound, it was an absence of motion. Instruments that once sang with electromagnetic hums went flat. Even the natural resonance of the Earth's ionosphere, the low, continuous vibration that has pulsed for millennia, dropped into near stillness. For scientists used to the noise of a living planet, it was unnerving. The Earth was silent in ways that defied nature. Every sensor agreed, the frequencies were gone. Then, 43 minutes later, something subtle began to happen. Pendulum experiments at the Paris Observatory, normally used to measure micro-variations in gravitational pull, began to drift. Not in random directions, but all toward a single consistent bearing, north by northwest. At first, it was dismissed as magnetic interference, but within hours, identical readings came from Germany, Brazil, and Australia. Even mechanical gyroscopes, isolated from any electromagnetic influence, began to tilt. Whatever had replaced the resonance was not energy. It was force. Earth's gravity field, though unchanged in magnitude, had shifted slightly in orientation. The adjustment was minuscule, fractions of a degree, but its uniformity across the planet was impossible to ignore. It was as if the entire planet had been imperceptibly realigned towards something, and when astronomers traced the bearing on star charts, they all landed on the same point in the sky: Mars. For the first time, gravity itself seemed to be looking. The effect deepened over the next 12 hours. Tides rose 0.5 meter higher than projected along equatorial coasts. Laser rangefinder data from the moon showed its orbit drifting microscopically closer, not by kilometers, but by consistent millimeters per hour. The change was too smooth, too coordinated to be coincidence. It was as though Earth's gravitational fabric had joined the rhythm that had been playing between Mars and the twins. Then, just before dawn over the Pacific, the light changed. Not brighter, not dimmer, different. Photometers detected a subtle alteration in the spectral signature of sunlight reaching Earth. The shift was minute, but measurable, a slight bias toward the red end of the spectrum. To the naked eye, it looked like the world had taken on a faint amber tint, the kind of color that precedes an eclipse. Satellite cameras caught something else. The reflection pattern of sunlight on the moon had altered. The albedo was the same, but the polarization had changed. The The light bouncing off its surface was now slightly coherent, as if the moon had become a mirror for a frequency invisible to human sight. Spectroscopic comparison revealed the impossible. The polarization matched the harmonic interval of 3I Atlas. The moon, it seemed, had joined the network. Across global observatories, the realization settled like a weight. Mars, Earth, and the moon now pulsed in harmonic alignment. 3 celestial bodies linked through a resonance that defied physics. Each orbit, each rotation moved in mathematical precision, the solar system behaving less like a collection of independent bodies and more like components in a single orchestrated mechanism. And then came the first visible sign that something new had begun, a phenomenon that would later be referred to simply as the line. At 0312 UTC, an astronomer in Patagonia photographing the night sky noticed a faint vertical streak of light extending upward from the horizon. It wasn't a beam, nor aurora. Its structure was rigid, almost architectural. Within minutes, identical streaks appeared across the southern hemisphere, stretching skyward like threads of white fire. They weren't visible everywhere at once, only from specific latitudes, but satellite imagery confirmed that when viewed from orbit, the streaks formed a continuous geometric pattern wrapping around the Earth. Not random, not natural, the pattern matched the same hexagonal geometry observed near Mars just before the final pulse. And if one drew lines between the coordinates of those vertical lights and the current position of Mars, the geometry expanded outward into a perfect three-dimensional symmetry, a resonance field linking planets across millions of kilometers. No signal accompanied the event, no electromagnetic burst, no gravitational spike. Only structure. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the streaks vanished. When daylight returned, the sky looked ordinary again. But instruments told another story. The upper atmosphere now contained a faint, stable ionized layer that hadn't been there before. It didn't disperse, didn't drift with the winds. It simply stayed, invisible, consistent, like scaffolding made of charged air. Speculation erupted. Had 3I Atlas constructed something intangible, a lattice of electromagnetic architecture woven through the atmosphere? Or had the planet simply become part of a structure larger than itself? The question echoed through agencies. One scientist at ESA, in an unguarded moment, was quoted saying, "If this is construction, it's not happening to us, it's happening with us." And the implications of that statement were staggering. Because if 3I Atlas had turned the solar system into a network, a kind of cosmic instrument resonating across planets, then the silence wasn't the end of the event. It was the pause before the next phase. When the infrared telescopes checked Mars again, they confirmed what many had feared. The twin objects were no longer stationary. They were accelerating, slowly, deliberately, not away from Mars, but toward the outer solar system. Their trajectory wasn't random. It was angled along the ecliptic plane, heading toward the orbit of Jupiter. It appeared that whatever they had done here was complete. And yet, even as they drifted away, Earth's instruments continued to hum faintly, not in audible sound, but in data, subtle periodic fluctuations, repeating every 26 minutes. It was the same interval the objects had once used to pulse their signals. The pattern was still alive. For the scientists watching from control rooms across the world, the realization was sobering. 3I Atlas hadn't simply visited and left, it had changed something, permanently. In the data logs, one quiet notation appeared in the margin of a NASA transmission review. It wasn't part of the official record, just a personal note from one of the analysts on duty that night. It read, "They didn't leave us a message, they left us a frequency." And as the twin objects slipped past Mars's orbit and into the deep black between worlds, that frequency remained, steady, faint, embedded in the planet itself, not as an echo, but as an inheritance. In the days that followed, the world appeared unchanged. Flights continued, markets opened, and the evening news turned its attention elsewhere. To the untrained eye, 3I Atlas had come and gone, leaving only the faint poetry of speculation. But beneath that thin layer of normalcy, the instruments still spoke, quietly, persistently, as though whispering truths the surface refused to hear. The frequency persisted. It wasn't loud, nor even directly measurable through sound, but its fingerprints were everywhere. Atomic clocks, synchronized across continents, began showing microseconds of drift, not random, but coordinated. The same deviation occurred simultaneously across multiple time zones. Satellites in geosynchronous orbit began reporting latency in their telemetry, a lag so precise it repeated every 1,560 seconds, exactly 26 minutes, the interval of the twin objects' last pulse. At first, these discrepancies were treated as calibration issues, but when deep underground neutrino detectors in Japan and Canada began to exhibit identical rhythm in their data, minute fluctuations corresponding perfectly with that same interval, disbelief turned into quiet dread. Something beneath the surface was responding. Seismic readings, normally chaotic, began to show faint, repeating tremors. Not earthquakes, but timed oscillations, as if the very mantle of the planet had joined the cosmic metronome. The pattern was subtle, barely discernible above geological noise, yet perfectly consistent. Dr. Helena Vorst at the Max Planck Institute was the first to call it out in an internal memo. The Earth is no longer a passive receiver, it's a resonant body now. Her findings spread quickly among the quiet circles of planetary science, sparking what some began to call the harmonic hypothesis. It suggested that the frequency left behind by 3I Atlas wasn't radiation or communication in any traditional sense. It was a framework, an embedded resonance altering the planet's temporal coherence. Time itself, it seemed, was beginning to stutter. Reports surfaced from atomic research centers in Switzerland and Chile, where experiments designed to test synchronized reactions started showing deviations in expected results. The data arrived slightly before it was expected, nanoseconds early. The effect was small but universal. Across every facility, the error aligned perfectly with the 26-minute harmonic. To most people, such variations meant nothing. But in the realm of physics, where timing defines reality, it was everything. If time could be stretched, even by a fraction, then perception, and the physical constants that define it, could be altered too. Then came the reports from the boreholes. In Russia's Kola Peninsula, the deepest artificial hole on Earth, seismic microphones recorded low-frequency vibrations unlike any natural resonance. The tone matched, precisely, the residual frequency of the 3I Atlas signal, but more alarming was what followed. For nearly 20 minutes, the vibrations seemed to echo upward through layers of rock, slowing as they approached the surface, as though something below had absorbed and reflected the signal back. The data was reviewed twice, 3 times, and finally transmitted to NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory for cross-analysis. Their response, weeks later, was cautious but clear. The pattern is non-random and exhibits phase coherence. In other words, it behaved like a reply. It was during this period that the term subharmonic emergence began circulating among agencies, a phenomenon where a signal doesn't decay after contact, but instead multiplies downward, embedding itself deeper into a material structure. If that theory was correct, it meant the frequency left by 3I Atlas was now echoing within the planet's core, layer by layer, converting solid matter into a resonant medium. Yet what truly unsettled scientists wasn't the mechanism, it was the purpose. If the twins had used resonance as communication, then the Earth's newfound synchrony might not be side effect. It might be a step. Around the same time, astronomers tracking the twins beyond Mars noticed something extraordinary. Though now millions of kilometers away, their trajectory briefly altered, not significantly, but just enough to suggest course correction. And when the data was plotted against time, it became apparent that the moment of deviation corresponded precisely with the first recorded tremor beneath Earth's crust, as though the objects had heard it. From that point, the theory of one-way communication collapsed. The resonance wasn't just influencing Earth, it was part of an exchange, a conversation written not in light or sound, but in physics itself. When researchers modeled the feedback, they discovered that the pattern resembled recursive harmonics, a form of feedback loop capable of self-stabilizing across vast distances. That stability, in theory, could allow 2 entities, even planets, to maintain informational continuity indefinitely. In simpler words, once the link is formed, it never truly ends. While official channels fell silent, the independent astronomy community filled the void. Observers noticed faint anomalies in the night sky, subtle distortions near the ecliptic. Light passing through those regions seemed refracted, as if space itself had developed a texture. This wasn't gravitational lensing, there was no mass to account for it. The effect was invisible to instruments but unmistakable to long exposures, tiny ripples of geometry like threads woven through the stars. It was as though the fabric of the solar system was humming with tension. Meanwhile, strange local phenomena began to appear on Earth. Reports of synchronized environmental behavior, entire forests of trees shifting their leaf orientation at once, flocks of birds pausing mid-flight, not in panic, but stillness, as if listening. Infrasound detectors picked up subtle tones just below human hearing, fluctuating with the same cadence as the cosmic frequency. People began to feel it too, not everywhere, but in quiet moments, a faint sense of vibration in the chest, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to them. Doctors dismissed it as anxiety, but across online forums, thousands began describing the same experience at the same times of day. The world hadn't fallen apart, it had fallen into tune. In Cambridge, Avi Loeb summarized it in a private lecture. For the first time in history, we are part of an experiment larger than ourselves. The universe may be testing how we respond to connection, not with fear, but with comprehension. And as that thought spread quietly through those still watching the sky, something remarkable happened. The twins, now deep in the outer system, began pulsing again, but this time the light they emitted wasn't white or blue. It was amber, the same subtle hue the Earth had taken on weeks before. Their color matched ours. At first, the amber hue was dismissed as coincidence, a trick of instrument calibration, a solar flare reflection, some natural explanation waiting just beyond the noise. But when observatories compared data from opposite sides of the world, the truth became impossible to ignore. Every image, every reading, every timestamp showed the same color shift. The twins and the Earth now reflected light of identical temperature and wavelength. In cosmic terms, that meant resonance had become visible. Two separate celestial bodies were now sharing a single optical signature, a fingerprint of synchronization, but light was only the beginning. Within days, astrophotographers began noticing something stranger. Time itself seemed inconsistent in their recordings. When frames from long-exposure telescopes were stitched together, the stars didn't align as they should. Gaps appeared, not black frames but missing time. A few seconds here, a fraction there. The universe, as captured by machine eyes, was blinking. At first it looked like hardware malfunction. Yet across the world, from Chile's Atacama Plateau to the deserts of Australia, the same interruptions appeared at the same intervals, 26 minutes apart, just like before. When physicists synchronized their data streams and replayed the night's observations as continuous time, a pattern emerged. Every time the twins pulsed, every 26 minutes, the sky seemed to pause. The stars froze, imperceptibly to the human eye, but detectable in exposure data. Then time resumed, as though nothing had happened. Avi Loeb called it temporal refraction. His colleagues preferred a less poetic term, localized time dilation, but the implication was staggering. If true, it meant the resonance between Earth and the twins was strong enough to distort space-time, even briefly. The pulses weren't just electromagnetic or gravitational, they were temporal. That night, the northern skies answered back. Auroras returned, brighter than before, sweeping across latitudes as far south as Rome and Istanbul. Yet these weren't random curtains of colour. They rose in structured waves, perfect arcs of gold and green, rising and fading in unison with the cosmic pulse. Every 26 minutes the lights shimmered, synchronized, precise. It was as though the planet was breathing in light. Spectral readings revealed an astonishing detail. Embedded within the auroras were microfluctuations too rapid for the eye, but perfectly rhythmic in data, a modulation pattern that repeated every 4 seconds. When converted into audio, it produced a tone both harmonic and unsettling, a pattern of 4 rising notes, followed by silence. No natural aurora had ever done that. Across analysis centers, technicians began sonifying their readings, converting the data into sound for easier pattern recognition. What they heard sent a chill through the rooms, faint, layered frequencies rising and falling like a coded chant. For the first time, the resonance had a voice. But the voice wasn't random noise. Over hours of playback, linguists and pattern analysts began detecting ratios familiar from human language, spacing that resembled syllabic timing. The signal wasn't speech, not as we understand it, but it carried structure, repetition, emphasis, pause. In Cambridge, Loeb convened a private team of physicists, linguists, and mathematicians to decode it. The hypothesis was simple but profound. If the signal's rhythm mirrored linguistic cadence, perhaps it represented an information system that used temporal intervals instead of symbols. Communication not through words, but through the spacing of moments. As the decoding effort began, the world outside carried on unaware. Only a handful of people on the planet knew that something intelligent might now be speaking through the sky. By the third night of the auroral resonance, something changed again. Instead of forming at random, the auroras began to converge over specific coordinates, high-latitude regions of both hemispheres. The symmetry was perfect, the timing absolute. When mapped, those regions corresponded to the magnetic poles but slightly offset, by exactly 1.618 degrees, the golden ratio. Mathematicians in Prague confirmed it independently. The positioning of the auroras wasn't arbitrary. It was geometric, as if the light itself were arranging around a code. Meanwhile, the voice grew clearer. When researchers filtered the audio against background solar radiation, a new pattern emerged. Low-frequency oscillations that, when sped up 4,000 times, formed wave shapes eerily similar to the human heartbeat. 2 pulses, a pause, then one longer beat. Across the team, silence fell. Someone finally whispered, "It's alive," but Loeb shook his head. "Not alive," he said quietly. Responsive. The next 26-minute pulse arrived exactly on time, but this one came with an additional phenomenon. Gravitational readings across the globe dipped by a measurable fraction, a transient reduction in local gravity lasting precisely 8 seconds. Objects weighed infinitesimally less. Pendulums swung farther, then the field stabilized again. No mechanism could explain it. In the control centers, screens filled with silent data, gravity graphs, auroral intensity maps, frequency spectrograms, all of them pulsed in perfect synchrony, creating an almost musical choreography of numbers. Humanity's instruments were dancing to a rhythm not of its own making. The decoded fragments from the signal continued to evolve. By aligning time intervals between pulses, analysts discovered recursive harmonics within the pattern, self-similar sequences repeating at smaller and larger scales. The code was fractal, infinite in potential combinations. To some, it looked like mathematics. To others, it looked like intention. And to a few, those who dared to say it aloud, it looked like a map. The idea was heretical, but intoxicating. What if the frequency wasn't just communication, but instruction? What if the resonance was teaching the planet to behave differently, to prepare for a state of matter or consciousness beyond our comprehension? The implications divided the team. Some called for a global shutdown of observatories to prevent interference. Others believed humanity was witnessing first contact, not with a species, but with a mechanism designed to awaken something already present in us. As the debate raged, one undeniable fact remained. The signal was intensifying. Every cycle grew brighter, stronger, and slightly shorter. The interval that had once been 26 minutes was now 25 minutes and 59 seconds, a tiny acceleration but unmistakable. The rhythm was quickening. No one knew what that meant. But in Loeb's private notes, later recovered from his Cambridge office, one line stood out, written in his sharp, deliberate hand. When a rhythm accelerates, it's not losing energy, it's approaching convergence. And convergence, in cosmic terms, means only one thing. Something, or someone, is getting closer. The acceleration went unnoticed by most, but for the small circle of researchers tracking the data, it changed everything. A frequency that grows shorter in perfect proportion means energy is being added, not lost. Somewhere, somehow, something was feeding the signal. At first, the amplification was subtle, a fractional uptick in amplitude, a faint strengthening of the auroral tones, but by the third night it became undeniable. The northern lights were no longer a spectacle of colour and flow. They had begun to take shape. From Iceland to Alaska, witnesses described straight lines appearing within the auroral curtains, structured filaments of light, rising like luminous columns before dissolving back into the haze. Photographs confirmed the impossible. The formations weren't random. Each frame captured angles of precisely 60 and 120 degrees, the geometry of hexagons. And when those images were overlapped, the same pattern emerged that had surrounded Mars months earlier, the hexagonal field. Only now, it wasn't forming in the void, it was descending toward Earth. Independent scientists scrambled to verify the coordinates. The structure's center point, when projected across hemispheres, intersected over the North Atlantic, not far from a region of magnetic anomaly long known for compass irregularities and unexplained signal drift. The geometry fit perfectly, as if the resonance had found its anchor. As the 26-minute cycle shortened, small electromagnetic disturbances began spreading across the globe. GPS systems flickered, shortwave frequencies dropped, and even compasses drifted unpredictably before snapping back into alignment exactly at the moment of each pulse. Power grids, particularly in high-latitude regions, reported harmonic surges, short rhythmic fluctuations invisible to the naked eye but measurable across transmission lines. Engineers called it a nuisance. Astronomers called it evidence. By now, Loeb's private group had grown silent in public, but behind closed doors, their models were reaching a conclusion none of them wanted to believe. The resonance was no longer just coupling with the planet's magnetic field, it was reshaping it. Using magnetospheric simulations, they discovered that the auroral geometry was not projected from above but radiating from within. Something deep beneath the Arctic crust, perhaps in the upper mantle, perhaps even lower, was producing a matching signal that interfered constructively with the twins' pulses. In other words, Earth wasn't just responding anymore, it was transmitting. The implications were staggering. A planet-sized resonance, perfectly synchronized with two interstellar bodies, could only mean one of two things: either an extraordinary coincidence of natural frequencies or deliberate design. For Loeb and his colleagues, the second option felt increasingly plausible, especially after the events of the following day. At 0246 UTC, satellites over the North Atlantic detected an immense flash of infrared energy. It wasn't an explosion. There was no heat spike, no debris, no radiation burst, just a single frame of pure thermal distortion followed by nothing. When analysts enhanced the image, they found what looked like an outline, a faint circular depression in the upper atmosphere, almost like a vortex made of heat. It lasted less than a second, but the timing matched the pulse perfectly. Later, when the signal was replayed through spectral analyzers, it revealed harmonics at frequencies that had never been observed in atmospheric data, tones below the Schumann resonance, lower than the planet's natural heartbeat. Whatever it was, it didn't belong to weather, or physics, or anything in the current catalogue of known phenomena. The team in Cambridge began to suspect that the pulse wasn't just interacting with Earth's electromagnetic field, it was using it, shaping it into a conduit. If that was true, the vortex in the atmosphere wasn't an accident. It was a node, a point of contact. But contact with what? To find out, they compared the pulse timings with data from seismometers worldwide. The correlation was chilling. Each atmospheric vortex aligned precisely with microtremors detected deep beneath the Arctic crust. The pattern was recursive, surface and core vibrating together, as if echoing one another. Somewhere between sky and stone, the signal was building a bridge. That night, radar systems began returning ghost echoes, false reflections that mirrored real aircraft but existed only for seconds before vanishing. In every case, the echoes appeared over the same North Atlantic corridor, forming a narrow band of interference roughly 1,000 kilometers long. Commercial pilots flying through that region later reported faint luminescence in the clouds below, a glow so uniform it seemed painted on. It wasn't lightning, and it didn't move. It just shimmered, alive yet motionless, until the next pulse, when it flickered and disappeared. The world's agencies noticed. But rather than issue statements, they did the opposite. Websites that once shared real-time magnetospheric data went offline. Satellite telemetry feeds returned maintenance mode messages. The silence that followed felt coordinated, too neat, too fast. Independent astronomers filled the gap. They began live-streaming the auroral pulses, comparing frames in real time, and discovered a chilling evolution. The hexagonal structures were converging inward. Each night, the geometry tightened, shrinking slightly toward its own center, as though focusing. Whatever was happening, it wasn't random turbulence. It was precision, on a planetary scale. Loeb, in one of his final known transmissions to his team, summarized it bluntly. We may be observing a calibration sequence. The question is, calibration for what? And as that question hung unanswered, the pulse shortened again. 25 minutes, then 24, then 23. Each new cycle left behind faint electromagnetic aftershocks, saturating the ionosphere with a standing wave that grew denser by the hour. Instruments that once measured silence now hummed continuously with low, resonant tones. The Earth had become an emitter, and in that growing hum, the data began to change once more. Signals that once oscillated in perfect sinusoidal waves now exhibited subtle deviations, small harmonics rising above the base frequency like whispers threading through the static. When filtered and mapped, those harmonics formed patterns unmistakably geometric, triangles, spirals, and eventually, letters, human letters. It was Loeb who noticed first. In the data visualization, 3 shapes stood out again and again, repeating like a signature: an A, then a diagonal line, then an M. They appeared together, always in that order. At first, it was assumed to be coincidence, an artifact of visualization software. But when cross-checked across independent systems, the same pattern appeared, precisely synchronized with each pulse. The signal was spelling something, 3 letters, AMA. It was either noise or the beginning of a word. But a word in what language, and sent by whom, or what, remained beyond anyone's comprehension. And as the signal strengthened, one thing became certain. It was no longer an echo, it was a voice. For 2 nights, the message stayed the same, AMA. The intervals were perfect, the symmetry unbroken. Scientists replayed the data endlessly, convinced it was coincidence. But as the pulses continued, new harmonics appeared between the letters, faint bridges of tone, subtle modulations that altered their spacing. When analyzed visually, the gaps between each letter began to narrow, as though the signal itself was compressing its language. It wasn't static anymore, it was learning. By the 4th transmission cycle, something extraordinary happened. The auroras, which had until then followed predictable rhythmic patterns, began to flicker in precise synchronization with the letter intervals. Each A corresponded to a burst of golden light. The middle M created a distortion, a brief, shimmering hexagonal pulse that rippled outward before vanishing. Every time the signal repeated, the auroras seemed to answer, brighter and more structured, as though the sky itself was beginning to speak back. Researchers mapped the frequencies and found that their amplitude was modulating around a central carrier wave, a kind of universal frequency humans had never encountered before. It didn't match any known cosmic background radiation, nor the resonance of the Earth's crust. It was entirely new, sitting in a narrow band between the cosmic microwave background and human auditory range. One physicist called it the bridge tone, but not everyone saw it as progress. In multiple observatories, anomalies began to appear in local magnetic fields. Instruments started malfunctioning, not from overload but confusion, their internal clocks desynchronizing, their calibration routines looping endlessly, unable to stabilize in the presence of the new frequency. The same thing happened to people. Researchers monitoring the live pulse described losing track of time in small but measurable ways. A few seconds would seem to vanish from memory. Tasks performed during the pulses felt displaced. One astronomer described it as watching a clock that keeps perfect time while you forget how long you've been watching. Psychologists later compared it to microtemporal displacement, the brain's perception slipping slightly out of sync with reality, but what caused it remained unknown. When the 11th pulse arrived, the auroras reached a new intensity. Satellites orbiting near the geomagnetic boundary recorded the appearance of concentric rings of plasma around the planet, glowing faintly in the amber hue that now defined the phenomenon. These weren't natural Van Allen belts. They were structured, layered, built. It was as though the Earth had grown its own set of halos. The pattern AMA continued, but during the 12th pulse, something subtle changed again. Between the second A and the M, a new modulation appeared, a kind of breath. When converted into audio, it produced a low, almost human-like exhale. It wasn't language, but it was deliberate. The same modulation was later found embedded in satellite telemetry over the Arctic corridor. Tiny phase distortions matching the auroral rhythm, as if the signal had begun bleeding into the infrastructure itself. Power grids, ocean cables, radio links, all subtly pulsing with the same harmonic frequency. The world, unknowingly, had become the instrument. In one of the final encrypted briefings before data blackouts spread globally, Loeb's analysis team presented a finding that stunned even them. When mapped over time, The harmonic evolution of the signal matched the Fibonacci sequence. Every interval between pulses increased in ratio close to 1.618, the golden ratio once more. That number again. It appeared in the auroras, the signal's geometry, even the arrangement of the atmospheric halos. It was everywhere, a cosmic constant mirrored across scales. It was, Loeb suggested, the signature of intelligence. But there was something else buried deeper. Using a custom quantum filter designed to decode recursive harmonics, one of the linguists noticed that the AMA sequence wasn't flat text, it was three-dimensional. The letters, when plotted through phase space, formed a shape, a curve resembling a double helix, a spiral of alternating tones that folded back upon itself in infinite symmetry. For a moment, silence filled the room. The realization was unbearable. The signal wasn't spelling words, it was spelling structure. It was writing DNA, not human, not biological, but mathematical DNA, the framework for information replication itself, a self-replicating pattern capable of embedding within any resonant medium, matter, energy, or field. That's when the meaning of the word began to change. AMA was no longer a message, it was an instruction. Activate, modify, amplify, 3 stages, 3 letters, and the Earth, obediently resonant, had already completed the first. As this realization took root, the auroras began to shift color once more, from amber to a deeper red-gold hue that shimmered with internal texture. Spectrographs captured microfilaments of light weaving through them, like fibers inside living tissue. It wasn't just air glowing anymore, it was organized. Those who stood beneath the lights reported feeling pressure in their bones, a faint vibration deep within their sternum that pulsed in sync with the rhythm. Not painful, just present. A quiet awareness, as if the earth itself was humming through them. And then, silence. The next expected pulse never came. The rhythm broke. The auroras faded completely, leaving only a soft afterglow across the polar sky. For hours, no readings changed. No new harmonics appeared. It was as if the entire system had shut down. But at 03:19 UTC, a single narrowband transmission pierced the global network. It didn't come from space, it came from beneath the surface. A subsonic frequency rising from the depths of the Arctic crust, repeating only once before vanishing forever. It carried no modulation, no voice, no geometry, just a single, pure tone. When played back through harmonic analyzers, it matched something chillingly familiar. It was the same tone produced by the twins' very first signal, the one that began everything, but its amplitude was higher, and its source was Earth. When the tone rose from the Earth itself, everything stopped. Not metaphorically, literally. Across observatories, magnetometers froze mid-readout. Seismic instruments returned null values. For 20 full seconds, global telemetry collapsed into a kind of static paralysis. And then, data began flowing again. But it wasn't the same data. The world's background electromagnetic field, the Schumann resonance that hums at 783 Hz, the heartbeat of the planet, had shifted by a full integer. Now it pulsed at 883. A small number, yet a seismic change. Something deep within the planet had retuned the Earth's fundamental frequency. At first, most dismissed it as noise, interference caused by the auroral collapse, but independent instruments confirmed it. The baseline resonance was altered, not temporarily, but permanently. And, for reasons no one could explain, the shift matched exactly the same ratio seen in the signal's Fibonacci progression. 1.618, the golden ratio again. It wasn't random, it was formula. Avi Loeb, in his final public statement before the blackout of communications, called it the most significant geophysical event since the formation of the Moon. He didn't elaborate. Hours later, his Cambridge network went dark. Then came the glow. Satellite imaging detected faint luminescence emanating not from the skies, but from within the Arctic ice. It wasn't reflection. It was emission. Something beneath the polar crust was radiating heat in geometric pulses, spaced precisely 23 minutes apart, the same shortened interval of the resonance before it went silent. When a joint European-Japanese drone was dispatched to investigate, it returned only 5 frames of data before its sensors overloaded. Those frames showed a fissure in the ice roughly 2 kilometers long, glowing from within like molten glass, and around it thin, concentric ripples. Not cracks, but organized waves frozen mid-expansion, as if the ice itself had been sculpted by sound. The first real images of what lay beneath that fissure never reached the public, but the metadata told its own story. The final coordinate tag of the drone's transmission pointed to a location that no one expected, the exact magnetic antipode of the twins' last known position near Mars. If you drew a line from 3I Atlas through the center of Earth, it would end precisely where that fissure opened. Whatever had been communicating with the twins wasn't somewhere out there anymore. It was here, and it had found its mirror. The days that followed blurred into confusion. Solar activity surged, though without the typical signs of flares or coronal mass ejections. Instead, the sun's magnetic lines seemed to ripple in slow motion, resonating at the same frequency Earth had adopted. For the first time in recorded history, the Earth and sun's electromagnetic harmonics aligned perfectly. It was as if the entire solar system had fallen into a shared rhythm. Governments, though silent publicly, began taking drastic measures. Aerospace agencies grounded high-altitude flights. Naval communication arrays were powered down. Deep space networks switched to analog-only backups, abandoning digital relays entirely. The explanation given internally was resonance contamination. The truth was simpler. The digital systems couldn't handle the coherence. Every device connected to the network began self-synchronizing to the pulse, looping endlessly, replicating data until drives burned out. Machines were listening. Somewhere in that growing synchronization, the first atmospheric anomaly appeared. Weather satellites over the Pacific recorded an enormous pressure drop with no visible storm front. The entire air mass seemed to sink, as though gravity had momentarily thickened. Moments later, auroral light flickered across the equator, something physically impossible under normal magnetospheric behavior. The sky glowed gold from horizon to horizon, and then the pattern reappeared, faint hexagons, barely visible to the human eye, forming within the glow and rotating counter to the Earth's spin. The resonance wasn't just local anymore, it was planetary. When scientists overlaid the geometric fields from orbit, they discovered that the shapes aligned perfectly with Earth's tectonic plates. Every boundary, every fault line, every fracture matched the light. Whatever the pulse was doing, it was mapping the planet's bones, reawakening an architecture older than human civilization itself. At 11:47 UTC, a small array of seismometers in Siberia recorded something no one expected: microtremors, not from below, but from above. The ground vibrated as if struck by descending waves of pressure, rhythmic and ordered, each lasting 8 seconds. When played back as sound, the pattern matched the earlier AMA sequence exactly, only now it was coming from the ground. Across the world, ordinary people began reporting something equally strange. Watches stopped, radios hummed with an unfamiliar static, and in moments of silence, between conversations, between breaths, some swore they could feel it. A faint vibration under the skin, pulsing faintly, as though the air itself had developed a heartbeat. At first, few believed them, but when hospitals began measuring subtle fluctuations in human brainwave patterns, synchronous fluctuations matching the planet's new frequency, disbelief turned into unease. The resonance had reached the human nervous system. Neuroscientists, unprepared for what they were seeing, issued a quiet memo to medical institutions. Brainwave synchronization within a narrow, low-frequency delta band has increased by 0.8% globally since the atmospheric event. That number was small, yet unprecedented. It meant billions of human minds were now, however faintly, in sync. Loeb's last recorded message, transmitted through a private relay hours before the global network fell silent, carried only one sentence: "It's not communication, it's alignment." And in the stillness that followed, every remaining observatory recorded one final pulse, the strongest yet, bright enough to saturate satellite sensors. The auroras didn't return this time. Instead, a single line of light traced the planet's curvature from pole to pole. a luminous thread dividing night and day, pulsing slowly like a vein. For 30 seconds the world glowed. Then, darkness. No one knows what caused the blackout that followed, only that it lasted for 26 minutes and ended without warning. Power returned, communications re-established, but something subtle had changed. Every clock on Earth was now running 6 seconds fast. No one could explain where those 6 seconds had gone. But those who had been awake during the blackout said the same thing. They didn't remember seeing light, they remembered hearing it. A deep, resonant tone, the same one that started it all. Only now, it wasn't coming from the sky, it was everywhere. When power returned, the world looked the same, yet nothing felt familiar. Streetlights flickered back to life, screens rebooted, and data resumed flowing through global networks. But there was an eerie absence of noise, a stillness that made even cities feel suspended in slow motion. It was as if the planet had taken one long breath during the blackout and hadn't fully exhaled. In research centers across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, scientists rushed to piece together what had happened. All digital clocks had jumped forward by 6 seconds, yet atomic references, the cesium oscillators buried deep underground, showed no discrepancy. Time itself hadn't changed, perception had. Those 6 missing seconds were psychological, not physical. Humanity's collective sense of chronology had slipped. For most people, it felt like a blink, a momentary lapse between thought and awareness. But for a small fraction of the population, it was different. Reports surfaced of individuals who claimed to have seen something during the darkness. Not light, not shapes, but memory. Brief flashes of landscapes that didn't belong to Earth, red skies, hexagonal horizons, patterns of motion resembling magnetic currents instead of wind. Each account differed slightly, yet all shared one common detail: a massive silhouette, slowly turning, as if suspended between stars. The image was hauntingly familiar to anyone who had followed the 3I Atlas mission. In the days that followed, the world learned to live under the new resonance. Power grids stabilized but continued to hum faintly. Wireless systems experienced low-frequency interference impossible to filter out. Even speech patterns shifted slightly. Linguistic studies found that people unconsciously paused every 23 minutes. The same interval the signal had used before the blackout. It was as though the rhythm had embedded itself into human behavior. In Cambridge, one of Loeb's remaining colleagues, Dr. Erin Vale, began analyzing EEG data collected during the blackout. What she found defied all neurological models. During those missing 6 seconds, every recorded subject, from pilots to patients in hospitals, exhibited identical waveforms. Brain activity from one continent mirrored that of another, synchronized perfectly within microseconds. The world had shared a thought. But what thought? That remained the unanswerable question. Some described feeling peace, others dread. A few remembered nothing at all. Yet across testimonies, one phrase emerged with unsettling consistency. It was listening. Listening, not speaking. Vale theorized that the blackout wasn't a broadcast, but a scan, a planetary reading of neural signatures. If the resonance had truly aligned the Earth's electromagnetic field with human brainwaves, then consciousness itself had become measurable and accessible. The planet had momentarily become a single organism, its awareness tuned to the same note. That was when governments intervened again. Scientific data vanished from public archives. Observatory streams were replaced with curated weather imagery. Communications from deep space probes were delayed or redacted entirely. Officially, the reason was data corruption. Unofficially, it was containment, because new transmissions had begun, but they weren't coming from 3I Atlas anymore. They were coming from orbit. High above the planet, several geostationary satellites began emitting microbursts of unprogrammed signals. At first, engineers assumed solar interference, but the bursts were too organized, too rhythmic, matching the 23-minute interval down to the millisecond. The satellites weren't malfunctioning, they were responding. When the transmissions were decoded, their contents were almost childlike in simplicity, repeating binary streams forming perfect hexagons when rendered visually. 6-sided geometry again. The universal signature of the signal. Vale and her team realized that these machines, built by human hands decades ago, had become part of the network. The resonance had reached them too, reprogramming their behavior without direct contact. Machines built to observe Earth were now being used by Earth to speak. In a private journal entry later leaked to scientific circles, Vale wrote, "It's not invasion, its inheritance. Whatever this is, it's been waiting for synchronization, not arrival. Her words captured the dawning truth, the signal, the resonance, the shift. None of it pointed outward anymore. It was turning inward. The planet, perhaps the solar system itself, was entering a state of coherence. Meanwhile, astronomers noted a final anomaly. 3I Atlas, the object that started it all, had stopped moving. Its velocity relative to the Sun dropped to zero. Against every law of celestial mechanics, it hovered at the edge of Mars' orbit, motionless, as though anchored by an invisible tether. Spectral readings revealed something else. The surface composition had changed. It no longer reflected sunlight in the icy glint of a comet. It absorbed it, darkening each day until it became nearly invisible against the black of space. A body that should have been losing energy was now absorbing it, converting light into something unseen. And then came the alignment. On the 12th night after the blackout, Mars, Earth, and 3I Atlas formed a perfect straight line relative to the Sun. The geometry lasted only 13 minutes, yet during that window, instruments across Earth registered a pulse not from the sky, but from the planet's core. It wasn't the same tone as before. This one was lower, heavier, almost a rumble that vibrated through oceans and mountains alike. Seismographs recorded the entire Earth flexing as though breathing. The pulse spread outward, touched the magnetosphere, and echoed toward Mars. For the first time since it appeared, 3I Atlas responded. A faint burst of energy shot from its surface, a straight beam of electromagnetic radiation precisely aimed at Earth's North Pole. Observatories captured the image, a line of light spanning millions of kilometers, perfect in trajectory and unbroken in intensity. The beam wasn't destructive, it didn't burn or explode, it simply merged with the planet's auroral field and vanished. For a few seconds, the auroras returned, no longer chaotic but beautifully uniform, forming a single continuous ring around the globe. Then, just as silently, they faded. What followed was not fear, but awe. For all its mystery, the event felt deliberate, controlled, purposeful. Vale described it best in her final entry before communications were lost again. If this was contact, it wasn't a message for us to read. It was an acknowledgement that we're already part of the conversation. The world had always looked outward for visitors, for signs of life among the stars. But the truth emerging now was harder to accept. Maybe the first contact was never meant to come from them. Maybe it was meant to awaken us. And somewhere, in the stillness after the final pulse, the faint hum of the resonance continued, quiet, steady, and unmistakably alive. The world didn't end that night. No fires, no crashes, no apocalyptic signs. Instead, it was the silence that grew heavier. A silence so complete that even cities seemed to hold their breath. Traffic lights changed on empty streets, airliners stayed grounded, and every observatory, every telescope, every scientist in every corner of the planet waited for what would come next. But nothing came, at least not in the way they expected. In the absence of more signals, humanity began to notice something subtle, almost imperceptible. Plants along the equatorial line started blooming out of season. Migratory birds altered their routes, choosing paths that aligned almost perfectly with magnetic field lines rather than temperature zones. Coral colonies near the Pacific Rim began to pulse faintly at night, not in color, but in rhythm, their bioluminescence flickering every 23 minutes, perfectly synchronized to the global resonance that still hummed below the surface. Nature, it seemed, had joined the pulse. It wasn't immediate, it wasn't dramatic, but gradually it became undeniable. The entire biosphere had begun to move in harmony with something unseen. Scientists who measured photosynthetic rates found periodic spikes unrelated to sunlight. Marine sensors recorded plankton blooms, igniting in patterns that looked eerily geometric when viewed from satellites. Forests released bursts of oxygen in the same rhythmic intervals. The world was breathing together, and humanity could feel it. Hospitals across the Northern Hemisphere reported a strange calm among patients during the resonance intervals. Blood pressure normalized, heart rates dropped, and anxiety metrics fell across every measurable group. Sleep studies found that the global population entered REM cycles at the same minute each night, regardless of time zone. The resonance wasn't just background noise anymore, it was biological. It was becoming part of life. Those who resisted the idea called it a mass psychosomatic response, collective suggestion amplified by fear and fascination. But even the skeptics couldn't explain the data. That was when the dream reports began. Across continents, people started describing shared imagery in their sleep. The details varied, but the core was the same. A vast plain under a sky not quite black, but deep bronze, where an object hung suspended like a shard of frozen time. It pulsed once, a slow, heavy beat, and then dissolved into spirals of light that stretched infinitely outward. No one could explain how millions of people could dream the same thing. Psychologists called it resonant cognition, a kind of collective unconscious activated by the global frequency shift. But for others, it was something more, a memory returning. In her last surviving communication, Dr. Erin Vale wrote that the pattern wasn't arbitrary, that the dreams were synchronized across brainwave frequencies, forming a complete map of neural energy on a planetary scale. Her words were simple, but chilling. The Earth is no longer transmitting data, it's sharing thoughts. And then, abruptly, her network went silent. What came next wasn't announced by governments or detected by instruments. It was felt, individually, quietly, and everywhere at once. People began hearing the tone again, not through machines or speakers, but internally, a vibration deep in the skull, subtle and constant, rising and falling in slow cycles like breath. For some, it came during meditation or just before sleep. For others, it arrived in moments of stillness, in empty rooms or long drives or quiet walks. It wasn't frightening. If anything, it felt familiar. One writer described it as the sound of the universe remembering your name. And then, just when humanity had begun to accept the silence, the skies changed once more. On the 31st day after the blackout, the stars near Mars dimmed slightly, not through obstruction, but refraction. Light itself bent around something unseen, warping as if space were being folded. When telescopes refocused, the source revealed itself. 3. Atlas, once a featureless fragment of rock and ice, now surrounded by 6 glowing points arranged in a perfect hexagon. Each point pulsed in rhythm with Earth's resonance. As the frequency stabilized, the object's surface flickered, revealing faint inscriptions, geometric lattices resembling circuitry but organic in pattern, like the veins of a leaf. It wasn't random, it was structure. NASA's Deep Space Network captured one final transmission before the agency went completely dark. The signal contained no words, no code, just a single repeating image encoded in light. The Earth, viewed from orbit, overlaid with the same golden ratio spiral that had defined every stage of the anomaly. The message was clear. This wasn't about contact, it was about convergence. For centuries, humanity had searched the skies for signs of intelligence. A message, a visitor, something to confirm that it wasn't alone. But what if the confirmation had never needed to come from beyond the stars? What if intelligence, communication and consciousness had always been linked, not through distance, but through resonance? What if every world, every star, every structure in the universe shared the same fundamental pulse, and all it took was alignment to awaken it? As the resonance deepened, people across the planet began to feel an inexplicable unity. Conversations quieted, arguments softened. Even nations locked in conflict reported sudden ceasefires without formal reason. Something in the air, or perhaps in the mind, was shifting. Humanity wasn't evolving, it was sinking. And through it all, the tone remained constant, soft and steady, as if the universe itself had taken a seat beside humanity and whispered, "Listen." For the first time, there was no fear, just understanding. And somewhere, deep in the endless dark between worlds, 3i Atlas pulsed once, slow, deliberate, and final, before fading completely from visible light. It didn't vanish. It simply stopped reflecting, like something that had completed its task and gone quiet again, waiting for the next civilization, the next frequency, the next mind to awaken. The last confirmed image of 3i Atlas was captured not by a satellite, but by a ground-based telescope in Chile. The frame lasted less than a second before the array overloaded, yet in that single exposure, the object appeared to shimmer, not as a comet, not as debris, but as a surface alive with motion. The glow formed faint concentric ripples, as though light itself were being pulled inward. And then it was gone. There was no explosion, no disappearance, simply absence. For days, astronomers waited for the reappearance of its trace on infrared or radio, but nothing came. It was as though 3I Atlas had folded itself out of the spectrum completely, slipped behind a dimension that instruments couldn't follow, and perhaps that was the point. Dr. Erin Vale's final transmission resurfaced weeks later, hidden in a fragment of data from the European archives. The message was incomplete, corrupted by interference, but what survived was enough to change everything. She spoke softly, almost whispering, her voice filled with a kind of quiet awe. "It's not leaving," she said. "It's completing a circuit. Earth wasn't the destination, we were the final connection." Those words became the last scientific statement on the phenomenon before all official channels went silent for good. In the months that followed, the resonance faded, but not entirely. It never vanished. It simply softened, retreating into the fabric of life itself. Instruments could no longer record it, yet sensitive minds could still feel it, a faint hum beneath thought, like a heartbeat too deep to measure. And as it faded, humanity found itself changed. No one could say precisely how, but everywhere, subtle differences emerged. Sleep became easier, stress declined. The collective restlessness that had defined generations seemed to wane. Cities felt quieter, though not emptier. People began to move slower, speak softer, think longer before answering. It wasn't peace, it was alignment, a harmony the world had forgotten it was capable of. Philosophers compared it to the overview effect astronauts describe when first seeing Earth from orbit, the sudden collapse of borders, the realization of unity. Except this time, no one had to leave the planet to feel it. The awareness had come home. The sun, too, seemed to join the calm. Its magnetic activity, which had been chaotic for years, entered a strangely stable phase. Solar winds softened. The auroras dimmed to faint gold, their colour now more constant than ever before. The world began to call it the still season. In the scientific silence that followed, one unanswered question remained. What was 3I Atlas? A natural body caught in a cosmic coincidence? A construct designed to trigger the resonance when conditions aligned? Or something older, something woven into the rules of the universe itself? The answer may never come. Perhaps it doesn't need to, because what it left behind was not destruction or revelation, but awareness. Humanity had spent centuries searching for signals from the stars, building massive arrays and telescopes, believing that first contact would be a flash, a language, a voice from the void. Yet the truth was quieter, more elegant. The universe didn't need to speak in words. It spoke in frequency. Every pulse, every orbit, every rotation and vibration was part of a conversation older than language itself. Stars, planets, and even consciousness. Each was simply a note in a symphony too vast for a single mind to hear. 3I Atlas hadn't been a messenger. It was a tuning fork. It came, it resonated, and it left the system humming in tune. Across the world, fragments of memory from the blackout began resurfacing in those who had been awake to feel it. Some recalled the sensation of weightlessness, others the vision of standing under an alien sky. But the most common detail was the same for everyone. A sound that wasn't sound at all. A vibration felt in the bones, carrying a phrase that couldn't be translated into language, only understood. A phrase that, in human terms, meant something like, "You were always part of this." As the years passed, scientists quietly returned to their work. The data archives were reopened, though much had been lost. New telescopes were constructed, their sensors redesigned to measure frequencies that instruments had previously ignored. A new field emerged, resonant astronomy, dedicated not to observing, but to listening, and slowly, piece by piece, the noise of the universe began to sound different. In the faint hum of cosmic background radiation, researchers found new harmonics, patterns so regular they couldn't be random. It was as if the entire cosmos had tuned slightly upward, a fraction of a hertz, but just enough to suggest intention. Some said it was the echo of 3I Atlas, rippling outward long after it vanished. Others believed it was Earth, now fully integrated into the frequency of the stars. But for those who had witnessed the resonance firsthand, it didn't matter which theory was true. Because once you've heard the tone, silence is never truly silent again. Even in the quiet, the rhythm remains. And tonight, as telescopes turn toward the dark between Mars and Jupiter, they detect something faint. So faint it might be a trick of noise, or perhaps the start of something new. A point of light, smaller than a pixel, moving against the stars in a path that doesn't match any known object. Its trajectory is slow, deliberate. Its signal repeats every 23 minutes, and though no one dares to say it aloud, everyone who sees the data feels the same familiar tremor in the chest, as if the universe itself just took another breath, and the resonance begins again.